I will just be blunt and honest about it and say, let me introduce both a good friend and someone who has a wealth of experience around affirmatively furthering fair housing, not only as it relates to HUD issues, but as you will hear the full gamut of any dollar that is spent of federal funds should go toward affirmatively furthering fair housing and creating opportunity. That's what he taught me. So have I learned? I got that? Okay,
That's
good.
correct.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, this afternoon until about 1:15 with Q&A will be Jeffrey May. Jeffrey, thank you.
So much. Thank you so much, Alex. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I first wanted to thank Mr. Charles Bryson and also Mr. Will Jordan and also their respective organizations, so the City of St. Louis Civil Rights Enforcement Agency and the Equal Housing Opportunity Council, as well as the St. Louis Law School and the Community Development Administration and Missouri Commission on Human Rights, as well as our wonderful partners at HUD. So good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me? All right, that's wonderful. So I have a lot to say. But I know that I don't have a lot of time, but no, let me correct myself. I do have a generous amount of time for my keynote remarks, but I also want to shamelessly plug, on tomorrow, I'll be also speaking with Deputy Assistant Secretary George Williams Sr., so we will continue this dialogue that we're going to have today and that we're going to start right now. So. As Mr. Bryson said, I'm Jeffrey May. I'm the principal of International Development and Planning. We are a for-profit, minority-owned firm that supports local, state, and federal agencies in their community development and economic development investment projects. That's a lot. But what I was doing kind of in tandem, because my firm has been around since 2005, for the past 7 years, I've been the assistant director of the National Neighbors Program at the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. So for the past 7 years, plus you would say 11 before that, I have been in enforcement. I'll say it again. I have been in enforcement, principally enforcing 42 U.S.C. 3604, which is the Fair Housing Act, and 3605, and also 3608, which now we are now it's codified at 24 CFR Part 5 or 5.15. So that would be the affirmatively furthering reg and the final rule that we all are going to talk about today. So that's a little bit about me, but what's most important about me is that I'm actually here to serve. I'm a resource for all of you. I'm a resource for many of the groups all across the country. I guess say everyone across the country. My firm has the wonderful pleasure of being one of the national technical assistance providers on the Ask a Question Affirmative Furthering for Housing Reg. So that means any of you that have any questions about it, please, I want to encourage you to use that Ask a Question service. If you haven't used it already, it's a really good resource. And I'm also anticipating, as Assistant Secretary Gustavo Velasquez remarked about, additional resources coming. That means direct TA being provided on site, as well as the continuation of remote technical assistance that's being offered right now. So what I want to kind of do first is just I've been working with the title on this and the title of my remarks, so I came up with a couple of different ones and I've thrown them away because they just didn't work for me. So I'm hoping that my remarks, they're going to kind of center around the issues of race, the issues of class, and the issue of privilege, and those who do not have that privilege as well. So let me just kind of give you the goals of what I want to kind of deal with. I'm going to touch on a lot of the things here today, but I'm also going to use some of the time on tomorrow to actually discuss and continue discussion when we do our Q&A on tomorrow. So my goal, I want to describe what affirmatively furthering fair housing is and why it's important. I want to talk about the history of fair housing and civil rights in the United States. I also want to talk and remark a little bit about the laws that exist, that started at the Fair Housing Act. Actually, I can probably go back a little further than that, but we're going to, in my remarks today, we're going to talk about the Fair Housing Act. We're going to speak about the Americans with Disability Act. I'm going to mention that, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. That's very important because entitlement jurisdictions, when they are certifying that they are compliant with those federal laws, they are representing that they are aware of them and that they're making sure that their programs are operating in compliance with them. Well, examples of what happens when you do not comply appropriately: Westchester, St. Bernard Parish, Galveston, Texas. I won't remark about them, but in Q&A we can answer that. But what I will spend a little bit of time on, and I'll put up there as well, is Executive Order 12892. So after I give you an overview of affirmative further fair housing and the rule, and lastly, I want to wrap up with why we must implement affirmative furthering now and do it the right way. So before I do that, I do want to, can everyone hear me? I do want to kind of do a slight little icebreaker first, because there have been a lot of things that have been on my mind today. Has anyone been paying attention to the news? Anybody been paying attention to the news? Flint, Michigan. You familiar with that? You from Flint? You're from Flint? My heart goes out to you. I am outraged right now. I think we all should be outraged right now. To think that a municipal service, and I'm going to go, not only do I have my planner hat on, but I'm going to put on my sociology hat on right now. So food, shelter, water, that's under Maslow's hierarchy. Those are essential components for all of us to survive: food, shelter, water. So to imagine that my water's contaminated, that it's not fit for consumption, that it's actually a problem for human consumption, it's jeopardizing those persons who consume it. That is a problem. That is a problem. And what is despicable to me is to think that there are some elected officials who have said, we're not going to help Flint, Michigan. That's their problem. We don't know, we're not aware of how this happened, but that's their problem. We're not going to spend any federal money to assist and to try to provide resources to remediate this situation. That's outrageous. That's outrageous. In fact, I'm going to talk about in history. The reason that's outrageous is because when we're talking about municipal services, if we're talking about a township, a village, a rural community, a city, a state, be aware that there are federal funds that move through the state and to all those entities. So when we see growth in one area, or when we see neglect in another area, that is because there were deliberate decisions that were made. This is not by chance. It didn't happen by mistake. That means that let me correct myself. A number of decisions have been made to actually lead to where things are today. So again, I want to, Flint, Michigan, but I got a couple other ones as well. Have you been paying attention to the black actors and actresses in Hollywood? Now, this is amazing to me. These people are the people we watch. Many of us want to emulate, that we're fans of them. And we still see that even though they have the lives that many of us literally watch on television and the movie screens, they still are experiencing discrimination. Still experiencing discrimination. So much so that you have a number of them saying that they're not going to the Oscars, so that it can be clear that the world understands that there are disparities that exist in Hollywood. In Hollywood. Have you been, I'm still not convinced that you've all been paying attention to the news. You should be as outraged as I am about this. So another example in the news is actually in California, still in California, but we're in Silicon Valley. The black software engineers are being discriminated against. Oh, wait, I'm like, what? These are people who write the code for the big data. These are the people who we're encouraging everyone to go into IT and to go into services that really support that. So these are the persons who I think are really kind of the top breadwinners in terms of growth as an industry. And you mean to tell me that they're being discriminated against, that they're being locked out of Silicon Valley? I thought there was a dire need for engineers, for software engineers. How could anyone be discriminating in that sector? How could that be? But wait, I'm still not convinced y'all been paying attention to the news. I'm not convinced. So there's a couple other things that have caught my attention. I just want to kind of list some of those things off. Some of you have already mentioned them when you were asking questions earlier of Assistant Secretary Velasquez. So the Black Lives Matter, the prison industrial complex, where many young men and women of color are being housed and being steered into. It seems like we're more interested in funding, and even though it's a more expensive endeavor, of incarcerating persons versus actually developing them and actually educating them. So, just thoughts. Police brutality, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that. So, we don't just have Ferguson to look at, but we also have Baltimore, we have New York City, we have the issue of racial profiling, we have the unequal immigration policies based on race and color. Now, this is outrageous to me, to think that we have private companies that are using their lobbying dollars to fashion federal laws, to fashion and influence state and federal laws so that they can fill their beds and fill their beds with inmates specifically. Specifically, not just black, African Americans, those living in urban corridors, but Hispanic, Latino brothers and sisters who are actually coming to America to try to seek a better life. That has become, they're being steered directly into the prison industrial complex because there's a lot of money that has been made there. So wait a minute, this gentleman, he's been brought here to talk about affirmative, further, and fair housing. I'm not sure if he started talking about it yet. I have. So let's continue on this. We still live in, according to reports, still live in very highly segregated communities with lack of opportunities. The increase in income and inequality between the rich and the poor continues to grow. We also are now having, I'm not sure, again, I'm asking if you have you been watching the news, there's a new disease that I was unaware of called affluenza. I didn't know. So these are things that remind me that we do not live in a post-racial society. In contrast, these things are inextricable problems that we're tied to and that we must grapple with right now. So, though we know, even though throughout history that we've been dealing with the phenomena of injustice, and it's something that we've been dealing with since the inception of our great country, but the good part about it is that every step of the way, there have been those who have been fighting for justice. And so I want to thank you for being here and participating in this summit, this conference over the next 2 years. 2 days, I'm sorry, 2 years. The next 2 days, sorry y'all, I'm still sleep deprived. The next 2 days, but also what I want to do is try to share some information so that you can utilize this information and impart this to try to make your respective communities a better place. HUD is investing a lot of resources right now into affirmative, further, and fair housing, as they should. And it is our role, it should be our role, both those who are inside of government and outside of government, to really make sure that this is implemented correctly and making sure that it's having the impact that it should have, that it was intended to have, just as Assistant Secretary Velasquez had remarked about when the Fair Housing was passed in 1968. Affirmative, further, and fair housing was on the books at that time. Now we clearly are getting to a place, because in 1997 we had a really large book called the Fair Housing Planning Guide, which I read. One of the few people, I'm sure Mr. Phil Tegler has read that book as well. But there are a number of us who remember that document, and now we have a final rule that actually pushes us a bit further. So in that spirit of pushing us, that's what I'm going to do today. So I'm going to start with the history. a little bit. We're going to talk about that. So I am going to let you know, it is, it's a sad history of our great country. I feel like I don't do it as much justice as my colleague, Mr. Michael D. Mitchell, does in terms of his history. So many of you may have heard this as well. But it's necessary for all of us to understand, just as we are the sole sum of our collective experiences, that's at the micro level. At the meso and at the macro level, that means our places and spaces at the local and state and federal level are subject to the same thing. I'm going to say it again. We are the sole sum of our collective experiences. So that means in order for us to understand where we are today, we must understand our history. So let's start with that. So let's do this. Now, I do want to confess that many of you are going to see some of this on tomorrow in terms of my remarks with Deputy Assistant Secretary Williams. But I want to give you this information because I want you to really share with other people. Now, this is not Jeffrey's history. I also need to give credit to Larry Pearl, who worked on this from the National Fair Housing Training Academy, as well as some of the information. I previously worked at the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, as I shared with you all. So there's a lot of information that I've been able to gather and use that they've gathered, and now I want to share that information with you. So for us first to kind of start talking about civil rights and the history of fair housing, we first need to actually start at the end of slavery. So the Emancipation Proclamation, signed January 1 of 1863, promulgated in 1865, that freed the slaves. Now, be aware, and I have to remind people often, that the phenomena of, or the status of people of color being free in America, even though we have a wonderful and great country, and we use the Constitution, we need the Constitution, but unfortunately, that Constitution was not speaking and protecting all of us at that time. So prior to that time period, it was legal for slavery to exist, and it was legal, in fact, the intent was for persons of color to be permanent servants. We were never to be free. So passed the Emancipation Proclamation, now we have, we're free in 1865. Shortly after that, we have the passage of the Civil Rights of 1866. Now, the part that's important about this is that we have sections 1981, 82, 83, and 84, and 85. What those sections do, the part that's most important about it, in summary, is that it gave these newly freed slaves the right to be able to enter into contracts. So that meant that they could actually be employed, and they could also hold property. That's very important. Now, we need to admit and recognize that there were very minuscule number of free Africans at that time, or free Negroes at the time, or persons of color at that time, who actually held property, and in fact, a few of them actually held slaves. These were free people of color. They were Maroons, Octoroons. They often lived in the Badlands, or the lands that the swamps that were not far from many of the plantations, but a settlement took place. These settlements take place. That's important. I point that out so people understand, because people like to say, well, you know, there were blacks that owned slaves. Yes, but that was not the mainstream. That was not the predominant experience. The predominant experience was slavery as the system and peonage for persons of African descent. So we now are in 1866, and with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1666, we move into what we call the Reconstruction period. So the Reconstruction period is important for this reason. We have the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau. We also have the creation of the Freedmen's Bank. So this was an institution to really help those persons, these newly freed slaves, make that transition, understand what their legal rights and protections were, these new rights that existed, and also in the Freedmen's Bureau's bank, provide access to credit, be able to provide some access to a place for them to be able to have and place their monies. Now, I need to point out that the Reconstruction period was very brief. It only lasted about maybe 15 years, maybe 20 at the most, going to 18. 1880, 1885. What we also saw during this time period, so we're still in the 19th century. We're only 30 years out from slavery. So we have the reemergence, and this is something that you all may be familiar with because of the history of Missouri. We saw that as the federal troops were moving out of the South, we saw the rise again of the South. So we saw the vestiges of Jim Crow. We saw the black codes actually become the common law, and then at some point those laws were made official. So these black codes were things such as, now again, this Constitution that we got, I want you to reflect on that, especially the freedom to assemble. So under the black codes, in essence, all white citizens were tacitly deputized. You were in a position that you could accost any group of Negroes that were together, and you could literally ask them their business. And if you didn't like their response, you could tell them to disband, okay? Also, in the same way that during antebellum times, that if a slave was actually walking in the downtown center, any white person could ask them, I need to see your papers. I want to see who you belong to. Well, under the black codes, and even though we were past the Emancipation Proclamation, under the black codes, we still had that same type of exchange that could occur. You could have a white citizen ask, where are your papers, who do you work for? So we also saw during this time, moving from the 19th century into the 20th century, we saw many of the towns that really levied, the levee towns and other towns. So it wasn't just, unfortunately, African Americans, as we're called now, that were subject to that, but if you were Hispanic Latino, if you were Jewish, if you were a Native American, you could be literally sundown towns, you needed to be out of town by sundown. Out of town by sundown. So these are the things that we have, but we also need to kind of couple that with, we are moving from being an agrarian society to being an industrialized one. So what we have is that great migration from the South up to the northern cities, because that's where many of the jobs were, and as it, and it was assumed, or at least it was rumored, that there were greater opportunities for Negroes north. Well, unfortunately, as that great migration took place and they moved into the Chicagos, the Baltimores, and for that matter, all across the country, we saw the creation in the beginning of the 20th century of race-based zoning ordinances. Now, race-based zoning ordinances are just as they are. They were typically being passed, started being passed in 1905, 1909, around that time. And what they did in essence, now imagine, if I'm the city planner, if I'm the city manager, if I'm the mayor, I'm the county exec, imagine these walls being renderings or drawings of all of the streets in the city of St. Louis, okay? And what I had was, I would color code them. I would assign a green. That meant that, yes, that was appropriate for investment to occur there. I'm talking about security maps here, but we're gonna talk about that in a moment. I'm gonna assign yellow to indicate, well, that's a place I need to maybe be cautionary. I'm gonna assign a blue, that's a place that's maybe emergent. But then I'm gonna also assign a red. And what we found when we examine those security maps and we look at the race-based zoning ordinances is that there was a strong connection and correlation on the basis of race and ethnicity. Now, I wish I could tell you it only took one Jewish person, it only took one Negro, or African American, or 3 or 4. I wish I could tell you the number, but it seems that all it would take was that the hint that someone was going to be, a person of color was going to be moving into that community and showing of the property, that means a real estate agent showing the person looking around, that would create a panic. Now, in the 60s, we called that blockbusting. But what we saw was that as the private citizens were moving and fleeing, we saw that local government began to adopt those norms. They began to say, well, we're gonna make that a rule. We're gonna make that an ordinance. So as we saw the racial makeup and ethnic makeup of these communities change, we then see a decrease or disinvestment of the municipal services, okay? Now, I believe it was Shelley versus Kramer in 1945, 48, and, okay, wonderful, and Hurd versus Hodges that dealt with restrictive covenants, and we're gonna talk about that in a second. But, oh, wait, oh, yes. Oh, back up a little, back up a little. Excellent.
In the house where the school teachers are from.
That's fabulous.
Yeah, anyhow, she was the one.
That's fabulous. That is fabulous. So we see that we have a response, but the part that I want everyone to be aware of is that we have local government at that point taking on these values, these discriminatory values, these values that were perpetuating segregation. We see government action. We see government action. So we also at that time, and at the, I would say, 1920s, we move, first of all, we have World War I, 1914, 1918. We then have the Great Depression that occurred in 1929. What's important about that is that after every war, and in an instance, when I'm talking about the Great Depression in a moment, but World War I, World War II, Vietnam War, Desert Storm, after every war, there's always a boom in your housing construction. So we begin to see these developments being built. We begin to see FHA, which is Federal Housing Administration, building communities, and the loans that were available at that time. So we also see those GIs coming back and being able to use their benefits. Now, the problem, unfortunately, is that, as Langston Hughes spoke about in terms of being able to move into communities and be able to experience a better existence, that was a dream deferred for people of color. So FHA had, and also the public housing, I think it's USHA, United States Housing Administration, had federal policies that actually perpetuated segregation. So if you type in on the internet, FHA discriminatory underwriting, you will find these old underwriting criteria that were promulgated and utilized by FHA and also the lenders at that time, that we can look at and see were discriminatory, and that's really, in essence, almost where we got redlining from. But we got the redlining from the security maps. But in that FHA underwriting, it would state that African American or Negroes and other ethnic groups were not, it wasn't appropriate to give them loans. And in fact, under the public housing policies, it was encouraged to keep communities homogenous, meaning let the Negroes be where the Negroes are gonna be, let the whites live where the whites are gonna live, and even within the white community, there was a pecking order. There was a pecking order. So if you were Jewish, if you were Polish, again, a good book for everyone to read is called, or take a look at, is How the Other Half Lives. Jacob Riis, it's Jacobris. It's a pictorial of the New York tenant housing and really looking at how immigrants from Ireland and from Poland and from Italy were moved into the worst part of the housing stock of the city of New York. Now, we easily think and imagine that after they assimilated and were assimilated into America and accepted as white, that those persons who then moved into those terrible tenement properties were people of color. So that's stuff for us to be mindful of. We then move into the 1940s, as I shared with you all, restrictive covenants. Now, restrictive covenants, if you can imagine, because I'm a planner, you have a plat. A plat is like a 24 by 36 design or rendering of a subdivision. And the restrictive covenants are the instructions that can be written either on the bottom, or it could be a separate document that spells out exactly how all properties and parcels are to be utilized in that particular subdivision. So typical things that you would see on restrictive covenants are all parcels in this subdivision must be 30 by 100 square feet. All setbacks must be 20, 25 feet. No, those are reasonable. But some of the things that unfortunately are on restrictive covenants and are still on there today but unenforceable are no Jews, Negroes, or Poles are permitted to acquire, purchase, or be transferred property in this community. Very clearly. Now, today, I think there's only 2 states, California, and I believe, I'm not sure if it's the entire state of Massachusetts, have actually undertaken removing all the discriminatory language that's on those restrictive covenants. So that means that many of us today, if you're acquiring a property, when you look at the deed or or you look at the instructions for that subdivision, the same discriminatory language may be on the restrictive covenant for that subdivision that you're buying into. In fact, Baby Bush, when he was buying his Crawley, Texas ranch, had on his restrictive covenant that similar type of discriminatory language as well. So I want us to be mindful that everything that we've experienced, everything that you see, when you see the rural communities or the townships or the states where we are respectively, that these things do not just happen haphazardly, that there was a tremendous amount of discussion and deliberation that would occur publicly, and a lot of discussions that would occur behind closed doors that didn't involve people of color, that really shaped the way all of our places and spaces that we inhabit today, both the built environment and natural environment, shape those places and spaces, those decisions. So we have the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1968. I want to point out that there had been the entire time a tremendous amount of I'm going to say challenging of the power structure, challenging the status quo between the period of 1866 to 1964, unfortunately. We don't have any federal legislation, with the exception of one, legislation that really moves civil rights forward. But in spite of that, we saw the Niagara movement, we saw the women's suffrage movement, and then we saw the anti-war movement and then the civil rights movement. We've seen that in history. We've seen that documented. But unfortunately, there was only one piece of legislation at the federal level that actually continued to move progress forward in terms of civil rights. Anyone can recall that? Anyone? It's women's right to vote. That was the only piece of legislation between 1866 and 1964. Now, the courts were very active. The courts were very active. I won't talk about that because, Brown versus Board of Education, because I know there are a number of companion cases that actually support that. That's a whole separate training that I do. But what I want to point out is that we then have the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed that dealt with public accommodations. We then have the Voter Rights Act of 65, but we then have, as it was spoken about earlier, the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which is the Fair Housing Act. Now, initially, it was a very weak piece of legislation. It only provided protection on the basis of protected classes, let me correct myself, were race, national origin, race, color, religion, and national origin. Those were the only 4 protected classes that were covered. Those were the same protected classes that were actually covered under the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Not a lot of progress. However, we do have, as time marches on, the passage of the Civil Rights Act, of 1968, or the Fair Housing Act in 68. I want you to understand there was a tremendous amount of deliberation in Congress about this. There were many people who felt that this was outrageous, that this didn't make any sense. So we saw the filibustering. In fact, I just want to kind of remark about this. This bill was not the first attempt to pass a Fair Housing Act. There were several attempts prior to that. You had Southern congressional elected officials taking all kinds of outrageous attempts to stop this from occurring. So the filibustering that we see today, that's not the kind of filibustering that they were doing. I mean, you had people literally reading the phone book, reading the Bible, really trying to stop this legislation from hitting the floor and discouraging that. But when the Civil Rights Act, when the Fair Housing Act was passed, it was passed, unfortunately, after the aftermath of the assassination of Dr. King. When it was being signed, literally, the National Guard had to encircle the Capitol because there were riots that were happening and occurring all across the United States and in Washington, D.C. So you have to understand that this was a troubling time at that time when the Fair Housing Act was passed. Literally, blood, sweat, and tears of many persons lives were lost in order to get this, as I said, this very modest and weak civil rights law to be passed. Well, we move forward and we see that there are two changes that take place in the Civil Rights Act. In 1974, gender was added as a protected class, sex. I use gender to be politically correct, everyone, but in the statute it says sex. So at that point, we have 5 protected classes. And in 1988, that's when we have the additional protected classes, which are familiar status and persons with disabilities being added as a protected class. What I want to talk about, just briefly, is that when I put up here urban renewal, I'm aware that, and many of you have witnessed, as local government sought to utilize funds to renew itself, renew the urban corridors, we saw and understood that this meant and resulted in displacement of African Americans, and in many instances, really vibrant areas that were predominantly African American, where businesses were located, decimated. My understanding is that your arch says some of that in terms of that history, if I'm not mistaken. So to show you that in terms of how we make decisions, how local government makes decisions, has made decisions, those decisions, unfortunately, are the reason why we need to have the affirmatively furthering regulation enacted and implemented aggressively right now at this time. So we talk about the Fair Housing Act, exclusionary zoning. I'm going to come and pull up a couple other things. So we're now moving into the 90s. Do y'all remember there was an oil bust in the 80s? The SNL loan scandal that was down south as the oil, so there were a lot of properties that were lost. So we set up something that was akin to, we set up what's called the Resolution Trust Corporation. This was similar to the Home Ownership Loan Corporation. This was back in the 1920s. So its intent was to acquire properties, rehab them, put those properties back into commerce. Well, move from the 80s, then we, with the SNL and the oil bust. We then moved to the 90s, and you recall the dot-com bust as well? Remember that a little bit? We then move from the 1990s and start moving into the end of the 20th century and start moving to the 21st century. So we then see I shouldn't say that, we'll say growth, that's a more appropriate word, of predatory lending. Now, just to give you a quick definition of predatory lending is the use of abusive and exploitive lending practices that were undertaken to extract the equity out of the home of homeowners. Now, what we were doing, and I say we, because believe it or not, I've been in enforcement for 18 years, but I took a break and ended up working at one of the worst subprime lenders in the country. That's why I can say we. I'm still making up for that. Mea culpas. I'm still making up for that, y'all. But that being said, a tremendous amount of money was made, a tremendous amount of growth and home ownership occurred because we saw President Clinton say he wanted to increase home ownership, and the lending institutions gladly led that charge. So we see from the end of 1990, moving to the middle of 2008, and what happens? We have a bust. We have a bust of our subprime market. We have communities of color all across the country. I would say, for that matter, market rate communities all across the country, but it seems to more acutely have an impact on Hispanic and Latino households. Bust. Thank you. Oh, wow. Okay, good. Okay. Good. I got that. So what that translated into was all of these properties. First of all, wealth just being 10 to 12 trillion dollars. It was estimated that was the real estate value of all the mortgage loans that were originated in 2008, about $10 to $12 trillion, ladies and gents. But I want you to understand, as horrible, unfortunately, as that experience had been for the homeowners who were losing their homes and who were taken advantage of because of this, that is a crime. But what, in my opinion, what's a greater crime is actually, that's what was occurring on the origination side. What was happening on the investment banking side is outrageous. Outrageous. So to think that we were engaging in, we had credit default swaps, still have those. We have structured investment vehicles. These are almost arcane kind of investment vehicles to, in essence, insurance policies. So 10 to 12 trillion on actually what the real estate debt is in the United States. We have tied to that on the credit default swap side. I believe it was in 2006, 2007. It was on the credit default swap side, it was $72 trillion. But on the derivative side, it was about a half of a quadrillion. What? Half a quadrillion. 450 trillion? That's 15, if I'm not mistaken. And quadrillion, what comes after quadrillion? Quintillion. Who knows that? Jeffrey, who knows that? Who wants to know that? But I have to keep track of this because I want us to understand the impact of how we got to where we are today and how important finance is for us and access to credit. In fact, Jamie Dimon, who is the president and CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, said, access to credit is critical. Without having access to credit, all things stop. All things stop. So I want you to understand whether you are at the micro level, a household trying to manage and acquire homes or make improvements on your homes or acquire other properties, or if you are a small business person, or if you are a multinational corporation, credit is extremely important to you, and it's also important to our communities. I'm circling back. So that leads us all to our foreclosure crisis that we're dealing with right now. So I bring up the Resolution Trust Corporation because we have now something called NSP, which is Neighborhood Stabilization Program. And again, that program was intended to do the exact same thing, to really take those properties that have been lost due to foreclosure, bring them back online as affordable housing opportunities. That has been a challenge. I've shared with her first initially when they were trying to roll out NSP initially that was going to be a challenge, because to be able to, right now, to be able to bring on affordable housing units, we cannot bring on enough. We have a dire need for affordable housing all across the country. And I want us to understand that we have this need because we didn't plan for it. And we didn't plan for it because it's not important. I'm going to say it again. We didn't plan for it because it's not important. So let's move on. So there are a couple of laws that then we saw gentrification, but there are a couple of laws that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but the first one is the Fair Housing Act. Again, those protections are, the 7 federally protected classes are race, color, religion, national origin, familial status, disability, and gender. Those protections clearly are a part of the affirmative furthering reg and requirement. The next thing I want to quickly bring to everyone's attention is the Americans with Disability Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. But the part that's most important, and I'm getting to, is Executive Order 12892. That's what I'm trying to get to that, so please be patient with me, y'all. Now, that someone asked a question earlier. Well, aside from HUD, who else has this requirement? Who else? Are there any other federal agencies that actually have that requirement? And the answer is all of them do. Huh? All of them do. So it says here in Executive Order 12892, it says that amended requires federal agencies to affirm and further fair housing in their programs and activities, and provide the Secretary of HUD will be responsible for coordinating that effort. The order also establishes the President's Fair Housing Council, which will be chaired by the Secretary of HUD. So That means that all of the federal departments, agencies, and offices have that responsibility to affirmatively further fair housing. So that means USDA, Department of Energy, Department of Transportation. Also, those prudential regulators and their members have that responsibility, which includes FDIC, which is the Federal Deposit and Insurance Corporation, the Federal Reserve, OCC, which is also Comptroller of Currency, that's your national banks, and their members have that responsibility to affirmatively further fair housing. This isn't new. In fact, this executive order, if I'm not mistaken, was passed under President Clinton's second term. So when you think of the roads that you drive on every day, when you think of the retail spaces and outlets that we utilize and that we actually, we patronize, I want you to think about who shapes that. I want you to think about it. When we think about our housing stock, we think about the multifamily and the subdivisions. But let's even just do this. Let's think about the individual house. When you think about the house that you fell in love with, what do you like about it? What was it that you liked about it? Was it, it was close to family and friends? It was close to your place of worship? It was close to work. Maybe it's far from work, depending on who you are. The schools are good. All those things that you utilize to kind of, factor why you chose that place, why you like this place, why it's a place that you feel comfortable. I want you to think about that. I also want you to think about in terms of when you go into a hotel, when you go into any place in space located downtown or wherever you are. There were deliberate things that occurred to create that space. That's from your individual home, that's to the hotel, that's to the entire city or township or state or country for that matter. And so there are certain features that draw us to places. There are certain things that we think about that architects and engineers and planners have actually shaped to really draw us in. We have this reflexive relationship with our environment. It gives to us and we give to it. There's a reason that when you walk in a space as nice as this, you feel a certain way. When you think about when you walk into a hotel, the first thing, if it's a very nice hotel, the first thing that you're going to do, most people, if there's a mirror, is that I'm going to check myself. I'm going to do it, check, make sure I'm looking right. And then I'm going to walk in, and I'm going to carry myself a certain way because those persons who designed that place were trying to evoke and create a response in you, a visceral response in you. And that's the exact same thing I want you to understand at the meso and at the macro level, that those people who are planning and built our cities, who developed our cities, who wrote the plans for our cities, were doing and are doing today. Unfortunately, based upon that history that I shared with you, and there's much, much more to it, we see that those communities, places, and spaces were not built equitably. In fact, often it was an afterthought in terms of where persons of color were going to be able to reside. We heard Assistant Secretary Velasquez speak about we do not need to have in the 21st century people of color still living on the other side of the tracks, still living on the south side, still living on the portion of our housing stock that is the worst part of our housing stock. So that means that we need to start and with affirmative further fair housing, that is the place for us to actually make sure that we can correct the problems that unfortunately have developed over decades to try to redress and remediate those things to create better places and spaces. So in my last minutes that I have, I'm going to quickly move through this, and I want to leave you with these thoughts. So affirmative further fair housing means to take meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity based upon protected classes. It goes on further to say specifically, oh good, I only got 2 minutes left. It says specifically that affirmative for housing means taking meaningful actions together, address significant disparities in housing needs and in access to opportunity, replacing segregated living patterns with truly integrated and balanced living patterns, transforming racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty into areas of opportunity, and fostering and maintaining compliance with the civil rights laws. I'm going to close my remarks by saying that those who are wealthy and those of us who are poor, we need to understand that we actually need each other. We need each other. Not taking out, there's not an assault on wealthy people, we may be talking, when I say these terms, you can be like, wait a minute. Wealthy people, from what I understand, can move and live anywhere they want, anywhere they want. In fact, there's a rapper named Jay-Z says that, one of his lines, there's a condo in the Trump Towers that he slept in once. Most of us who are low to moderate income households are not moving because we have a desire to see what it feels like to sleep in the Trump Towers and have an investment property there. Most of us are moving out of necessity. We're moving to be closer to a job. We're moving because the school systems are better. We're moving because the water's clean in this particular part of the city or town. So I want us to all be aware that these decisions and the Fair Housing Act that we make, we need to be looking at it through that lens of affirmative furthering for housing, because most of us, unfortunately, don't really have a lot of control or choice to be able to control our own destiny. We actually are relying on, very often, the architects, the leaders, those persons who run the townships, the villages, the cities, state, and for that matter, the country, to be making good decisions to really shape the place and spaces where we live. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you. Thank you. Do you have several minutes for questions?
Oh, of course I do.
Darn. If anyone has questions for Jeffrey May, please line up on the right, and I would again ask, so he has some reference, if you would be willing to share your location of origin with him as we begin. We only have a few minutes left because we want to bring our 1:30 panel on, because I know that they have some travel things to make sure they are doing.
I apologize for being up here again, but not a question, but a comment. St. Louis is a baseball town, right? Right. And we all have a connection to Branch Rickey, for example, correct? And Branch Rickey was the guy who gave Jackie Robinson his start, correct? Well, Branch Rickey, how many people know that Branch Rickey developed the city of Town and Country here in town? No one? A few? Well, when you look at the restrictions, the covenants that run with the land in Town and Country, they say that only Caucasians of the Christian faith can live here. Wow. Understand that St. Louis led the country in covenants and restrictions that ran with the land. And the Shelley versus Kramer case resulted from a many-year effort by the NAACP to finally frame this issue and get it before the United States Supreme Court. And I would also contend to you this. If it was a white county executive up in Michigan that had let contaminated water go to if it was a black executive up in the county that had let contaminated water go to a white community, he would either be in prison already or getting ready for his trial. That's the extent of what we call institutionalized racism, because kind of, you see, everybody, the white folks, the white liberals, everybody kind of think up there, oh, that's a bad guy, but, you know, subconsciously, well, hell, they're black.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Are there any other questions for Mr. May? Seeing none, I know that there is a presentation that the Director of CDA would like to give.
I get to do this again. Charles told me I had one of these to do today. I used my best lines with the Assistant Secretary. So without further ado, Mr. May, I want to thank you for being here today. I want to thank you for your remarks and give you this as a token of our esteem. Thank you.
Thank you.